6 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in the hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Therefore, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. With regard to interpretation, for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Please also note that during the meeting, it is not permitted to take pictures in the room or screenshots on Zoom. In accordance with our committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses appearing by video conference, I need to inform the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me, and please note that we may need to suspend for a few minutes in order to ensure that all our members have access to translation. Okay? So, welcome to our witnesses today and to all our colleagues. It's nice to see everybody back at the table rather than on Zoom. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, September the 20th, the committee is resuming its study of potential trade impacts of the United States Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 on certain firms and workers in Canada. We have with us today the Aluminum Association of Canada, Jean Simard, President and Chief Executive Officer. From Canada's Building Trades Union, Sean Strickland, Executive Director. Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Dave Bilodeau, Senior Director, Natural Resources, Environment and Sustainability by video conference. And the Electric Mobility Canada, Daniel Breton, President and Chief Executive Officer. And for Global Automakers of Canada, David Adams, President and Chief Executive Officer. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing your time with the committee today. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with rounds of questions. Mr. Simard, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Honorable members, Madam Chair, thank you for inviting us as witness on the IRA. IRA is full of opportunities for Canada as it onshores demand from within USMCA. Solar, nuclear power, advanced manufacturing, home energy supply improvement, home energy efficiency upgrades, EV incentives, and U.S. Postal Service electrification. Near $400 billion U.S. in new and accelerated market opportunities for a primary metal producer like Canada, which exports 90% of its world-class production to the U.S. As North America moves from onshoring to friendshoring in its value chains restructuring, from critical elements and materials to strategic suppliers base, Canada stands in a class of its own. We have the critical materials, including aluminium, to enable the green shift in the U.S. economy. And we have both the human and carbon footprints to meet best-of-class criteria, including the democracy criteria as shown in the slide that was produced with our brief, from data developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit. When aligning aluminium-producing countries along with their carbon intensity, supply chain surety, and democracy score, we stand above the pack with Iceland, Norway, and Australia. As shown in the second slide, authoritarian regimes represent 78% of the total production in the world. Coupled with carbon considerations, it makes the addressable supply for buyers increasingly limited highlighting Canada's unique combination of qualities. But in order to reap the rewards of these developing opportunities, we will need to accelerate existing assets modernization. Our governments, both federal and provincial, should seize the moment to leapfrog into the future by setting forth an enabling fiscal environment to incentivize massive industrial modernization. As we shared with the House Standing Committee on Finance, the staying power required to remain in the forefront of the best of class will come through increased competitiveness in a fast-changing global industry. Government must look over and beyond traditional loan programs and grant access to some existing fiscal provisions, such as accelerated depreciation of capital expenditures, while revamping existing trade-compliant programs. At last, this is not a race to the bottom. It's a race to the top and towards the future. Let's rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simard. On to Mr. Strickland, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on the potential trade impacts of the United States Inflation Reduction Act on workers in Canada. My name is Sean Strickland. I'm Executive Director of Canada's Building Trades Unions, part of North America's Building Trades Unions. We represent 14 international construction unions with offices in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa. The combined membership of NABTU and CBTU includes over 3 million unionized construction workers, of which 600,000 are in Canada. The international unions that make up the building trades have a long history of working closely on issues that affect members on both sides of the border. In partnership with our employers, we operate over 1,900 apprenticeship programs and annually invest over $2 billion in training programs, producing the best, safest, and most highly trained skilled trades workers anywhere in the world. We advocate for good union jobs that pay family-sustaining wages, offer benefits, and a pension to ensure folks can retire in dignity. As you know, the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act includes over $300 billion in energy tax incentives for clean energy infrastructure. This is an international game changer. It incentivizes businesses that create union jobs and the hiring of apprentices by offering expanded tax credits. Up until the IRA was passed, Canada was leading the charge in the transition to net zero, from existing subsidies for carbon to investments to technological advancements in renewables. But with the passing of the IRA, the U.S. is clearly in the driver's seat. What happens next will set up the Canadian economy for the next several decades, which is why we need to respond vigorously, intelligently, and quickly. I am very much aware the Department has briefed you very thoroughly on all of the elements contained in the IRA. The nuclear power production credit, for example. The credits are increased 5 times if the taxpayer meets prevailing wage requirements. Clean electricity investment credit. Credit again is increased by 5 times if prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met. Hydrogen production credit. The credit will be 500% increased if certain prevailing wage, apprenticeship, and other requirements are satisfied. Energy efficient commercial buildings deduction, similarly. Carbon capture and sequestration credit, similarly. On the electric vehicle front, you will hear from some of the witnesses today on the changes there and how that may impact the production of Canadian electric vehicles. The Inflation Reduction Act also establishes Make in America provisions for the use of American-made equipment for clean energy production, something we have to pay close attention to. What the U.S. has effectively done is position itself to be a very attractive market for investments in clean energy infrastructure. Incentives that make it attractive to private equity, while at the same time improving the lives of American citizens by ensuring union wages are being paid and more people have opportunities to start an apprenticeship in the skilled trades. It's the view of the Canadian Building Trades Unions that we need to look very closely at these incentives and respond in kind, but respond in ways that are smart and recognize our competitive advantage. I think it'd be very difficult for us to respond line by line to all of the incentives contained in the Inflation Reduction Act. But are there areas where we can exercise and amplify our competitive advantage? On mining, for example, hydrogen production, for example, carbon sequestration, which is already happening. There's lots of examples where we already have a competitive advantage. Small modular reactors. Lots of projects are in development in Canada right now. So how do we use incentives and create a regime where we can compete and respond to the Inflation Reduction Act, but respond smartly? And as my colleague here said earlier, it's not a race to the bottom. So we need to be smart about it and also exercise the competitive advantage we have in our labor force. We have good skilled trades workers right across Canada. We need to continue to invest in recruiting and training. We need to also attract more people into the skilled trades in Canada. Changes to the immigration streams and easing cross-border mobility, for example, are some ways in which we can respond to the increased demand for trades right across the country. One of the biggest challenges we're going to have as we go through just transition is, according to some reports, Canada could lose up to 450,000 jobs in the oil and gas sector between now and 2050. So how are we going to replace those jobs with the new energy jobs of the future? This is a very important question. And how we respond to the Inflation Reduction Act is a big part of the answer to those questions. We have to make sure we can't leave any workers behind. So we transition out of oil and gas. We need to replace the jobs with workers, good union-paying jobs, in the new energy sources of the future, hydrogen, carbon sequestration, small modular reactors, traditional nuclear, et cetera. And if we're going to offer attractive incentives to the private sector to remain competitive on this front, Canadians can also expect that Canadians should expect that these generous subsidies are tied to the creation of good middle-class jobs that provide family-sustaining wages, health and welfare benefits, and pensions. The amount of tax incentives and credits that we are considering in response to the Inflation Reduction Act are in the tens of billions of dollars. I think the Canadian public would expect, and I would hope parliamentarians would expect, that any of those kinds of incentives would be tied to the creation of good, sustaining jobs. On behalf of over 3 million skilled trades professionals that belong to North America's building trades unions and our 14 affiliated international unions, the 60 trades that we represent, I want to thank the committee for this opportunity to present, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strickland. On to Mr. Bilodeau for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Madam Chair, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to attend today's discussion on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 presents opportunities for Canadian businesses. We must also recognize challenges facing Canada's private sector. To that end, I'll tailor my remarks today to focus on automotive manufacturing, critical minerals, clean tech, and labor. With respect to automotive manufacturing, the Act introduces and extends EV tax credits. Notably, eligibility for these credits ultimately requires EV batteries to be 100% made in North America by 2029. This creates considerable opportunities for Canada's natural resources and manufacturing sectors. However, given the protracted timelines to build upstream and midstream mining infrastructure, as well as the lead times to modify automotive supply chains, it will be difficult for automotive manufacturing firms operating in Ontario to meet credit eligibility requirements in the near term. This brings us to critical minerals. Global demand for certain minerals is expected to increase by up to 600% by 2040. This presents a rare opportunity for Canada, and the Chamber believes that Canada can serve North American and global demand for minerals required for electric vehicles and clean technologies. To match domestic mineral production and processing with increasing demand, it's vital to focus attention on facilitating resource development in Canada, where it takes an average of 15 years to move mining projects from discovery to first production. These lead times will impact Canada's decarbonization efforts while limiting opportunities to develop new and existing mining and manufacturing facilities across Canada. On the topic of clean technologies, the Inflation Reduction Act contains supports for domestically produced alternative fuels, such as hydrogen and biogas, as well as for clean technologies like CCUS. Further, the Act contains credit multipliers for products meeting domestic content and local human resources thresholds. Such incentives will make it difficult for Canadian clean tech firms to compete in the US market. While Canada's recent fall economic statement has provided investment tax credits for clean technologies, Canada must take further measures to secure a level playing field and to secure opportunities for Canadian workers. Lastly, a few comments on labor availability. A study conducted by the Blue-Green Alliance indicates that the Inflation Reduction Act will create over 9 million climate tech jobs in the United States by 2032, largely in STEM fields. The skyrocketing demand for labor in the United States will place pressure on Canada's ability to attract and retain skilled workers to drive its own green economy. This is concerning as the competition for talent is already a major pain point here in Canada, with around 1/3 of Canadian businesses experiencing labor difficulties. With these factors in mind, I would like to table the following recommendations for your consideration. First, to further develop our mining, clean technologies, and advanced manufacturing sectors, Canada must be able to compete for major capital investments. This requires securing venture capital for early-stage mining projects, accelerating the implementation period of the Strategic Innovation Fund, expanding fund allocation for critical minerals, and ensuring that incentives within the Inflation Reduction Act do not serve as non-tariff barriers to Canadian businesses. Second, to reduce mining project lead times, the Government of Canada must work with a broad spectrum of stakeholders to responsibly expedite development and permitting timelines. And third, Canada needs a green jobs strategy that brings together all levels of government, as well as private sector stakeholders, secondary and post-secondary institutions across the country, to develop the domestic capacity of skilled workers needed to drive our economy and build the projects that will get us to net zero. In close, the Canadian Chamber encourages the committee to carefully examine the regional economic implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, while also looking towards the boundless potential for Canada to drive global transitions to net zero. Thanks again for your time and consideration. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bilodeau. On to Mr. Breton for 5 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you. I would like to thank the members of the Standing Committee on International Trade for taking the time to study the progress and potential on the new U.S. Act. My name is Danielle Breton, CEO of Electric Mobility Canada. So we represent manufacturers of light, medium, heavy, and off-road vehicles, electricity and charging infrastructure providers, mining companies, technology companies, research centers, cities, universities, and we, in fact, are world's leading organizations in transportation electrification.
2022, approximately 50% of the energy jobs in the world were, back then, in clean energy, which includes clean transportation. Even in North America, where there is an important fossil fuel industry, clean jobs represented almost 50% 3 years ago, so before the big push for EV industry in Canada, led by federal and provincial governments. In the past 6 months, the Government of Canada has secured more than $15 billion in investment of tens of thousands of jobs in Canada's electric vehicle ecosystem. Canada is now developing an innovative electric mobility industry, from mining to assembly, to infrastructure, to education, to electricity production and distribution. And more needs to be done, as this is the fastest growing industry in the world. Now let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. Under Segment 45X for Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit, what we find when we delve into this is that if a manufacturer wants to manufacture batteries for electric vehicle, you can get $45 per kilowatt hour for every battery over 7 kilowatt hour. So if that doesn't sound like very much money, that's probably worth reminding you that $45 per kilowatt hour represents about 1/3 of the total cost of manufacturing an automotive battery, the most expensive component in an EV. More to the point, the average EV sold in North America has about 80 kilowatt hour, which means that if you look at that, it means that you can get an additional rebate for manufacturing the vehicle between $3,500 to $6,000. Remember, that's money directly in the automaker's pockets. On a grander scale, if you have a 30 gigawatt hour plant from, let's say, BMW, it would mean that that plant would get $1.3 billion, but that's not a one-time thing. That's $1.3 billion a year until 2032. I want to remind everyone that in 2021, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau agreed to work together to build the necessary supply chains to make Canada and the United States global leaders in all aspects of battery development and production. To that end, the leaders agreed to strengthen the Canada-U.S. Critical Mineral Action Plan to target a net zero industrial transformation, batteries for zero-emission vehicles, and renewable energy storage. To go back to battery manufacturing, we're not talking about battery being manufactured in the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, but just in the U.S. So to get that $45 per kilowatt hour incentive, it has to be built in the U.S. A few weeks ago, the federal government published its policy regarding foreign investment for state-owned enterprises in critical minerals under the Investment Canada Act, saying that the critical minerals list was announced on March 11, 2021, and includes 31 minerals critical for the sustainable economic success of Canada and our allies, minerals that can be produced in Canada and are essential to domestic industry and security. On November 2nd, the federal government ordered 3 companies to divest from Canadian mining interests since these investments could, and I quote, threaten our national security and our critical mineral supply chains both at home and abroad. On November 12th, a few days ago, Bloomberg New Energy Finance published its battery supply chain ranking that saw Canada rise to the 2nd spot this year after China, which reflects its large raw material resources and mining activity, as well as its good positioning in environmental, social, and governance factors, and infrastructure, innovation, and industry. Though a lack of significant cell and component manufacturing capacity means that most of the value of these resources is realized outside of the country, although recent announcements from the likes of BASF, General Motors, and POSCO show an increase in battery investments. Considering this, the fact that many of the critical minerals needed for EV batteries, propulsion system, renewable energy, and the military are in Canada, what can we do to ensure that Canadians do take advantage of our strategic position and do not end up just being, once again, a simple supplier of natural resources to another country, in this case, the U.S.? And how does the AMPC constitute violation of the CUSMA Accord?
Canada has the critical and strategic minerals, the entrepreneurs, the skilled workers, just as we've heard, the research and development capacity, the universities, the clean energy, and now the will. Now, we must help these workers and future workers to make this transition by securing a future in the electric vehicle and component manufacturing industry. We have to ensure that the Inflation Reduction Act
Continue then. Sorry to...
I was just ending by saying that at this time, the competition should not come from the United States. We want to be partners of the United States, but the Inflation Reduction Act poses a problem for the manufacture of electric vehicles and components, especially batteries. Thank you.
Mr. Adams, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak to you today on behalf of the 15 members of the Global Automakers of Canada. Our manufacturing members, Honda and Toyota, represent 55% of Canadian light-duty vehicle production through September 2022, while all members, as the exclusive Canadian distributors of some of the world's largest global automakers, were responsible for 62% of Canadian sales in 2021. I appreciate the opportunity to add my comments to those who have already appeared before the committee with respect to the impact the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act could potentially have on the automotive industry in Canada. Canada's automotive manufacturing sector is at a crossroads. We can compete and win against the best in the world. But, as others have noticed, the United States has introduced some truly massive subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act that will pull manufacturing clean tech investment away from Canada. The Clean Technology Manufacturing Credit, known as 45X under the IRA, could amount to as much, as we've already heard, of $3,600 to $6,300 per vehicle battery, a spectacularly large subsidy that goes directly to the battery manufacturer. The Government of Canada urgently needs to match or exceed this subsidy in order to avoid all battery production investment being diverted or relocated to the United States. The second critical challenge is the Advanced Energy Project Credit, known as 48C, which offers a tax credit of up to 30% on investments into the production facilities across a wide range of clean energy technologies, including facilities that produce components of electric vehicles. This vastly exceeds the investment credits offered by Canada. Again, it is critical that the government look at whether we can match or exceed these credits. On the incentive side, we were pleased that the IRA provides certainty that Canadian electric vehicles will qualify for the $7,500 US EV incentive, provided North American critical minerals provisions are met and battery components are manufactured and assembled in North America. However, these North American restrictions mean that, at least in the short term, far fewer, only 25 of 70 EV models, will qualify for the EV incentive in the United States, owing to the fact that the mining of critical minerals and North American battery production are both in their nascent development stages. Purchase incentives, whether in Canada or in the United States, remain important drivers of EV adoption, and as such, these complicated restrictions on EV incentives are likely to slow EV adoption in the United States, potentially slowing the sale of EVs built in Canada and destined for the United States, given that 85% of our vehicle production ends up in the United States. We're recommending that Canada double the federal EV incentive to match what is being offered in the US, but without imposing the restrictions that the IRA has included. Quite simply, EV mandates in Canada are so aggressive that our only hope of achieving them is with generous incentives to encourage consumer adoption. Looking at the big picture, the US is pursuing an aggressive industrial policy to maximize employment and investment in the auto sector and is willing to spend large amounts in order to do so. $20 billion in loans to build clean vehicle manufacturing facilities, $30 billion in production tax credits to, amongst other things, accelerate critical minerals processing and batteries, $2 billion in grants to retool existing automotive facilities to manufacture clean vehicles. We were encouraged to see in the fall economic statement that our government is promising a robust response to this challenge. We're urging the government to go well beyond the launch of the Canada Growth Fund and forthcoming investments in Canada's advanced manufacturing competitiveness. Canada cannot let this generational reinvestment in the automotive industry pass it by. We need urgent action by the government to provide a level playing field and to protect Canadian workers. We will be tabling detailed recommendations as to how the government can work to mitigate the investment drain into the United States arising from the provisions of the IRA and our pre-budget submission. Madam Chair, members, thank you for the time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adams. On to Mr. Carey for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'm going to jump right in with Mr. Adams because he did mention the urgency. Mr. Adams, we had some of your colleagues here last, November 1st. Mr. Volpe, you know, Mr. Poirier, Mr. Kingston very well. The consensus was that we needed an urgent response. My concern is we had the fall economic statement, and I don't see that sense of urgency in the government's response. You and your colleagues put out a automotive industry report card on the federal budget 6 months ago. The government has had 6 months to work on this. In the report card, you were talking about commitments to make a difference, and I'm just wondering if you could update the committee with the fall economic statement. It seems Canada is always running behind. It's responding to the United States. Could you please comment how we did with the fall economic statement in regards to things like the regulatory alignment with the United States, the commitment to building hydrogen fueling infrastructure for fuel cell vehicles, eliminating the luxury tax, the commitment for building charging infrastructure in urban centers, 4 million public charging stations. How did the statement do in addressing the issues that you brought forth in your report card?
Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Curry. I think what I'd like to start with in terms of answering that question is to go back to your comment about playing catch up with the United States or running behind the United States. And I think that's a core area of focus that as a nation we need to do a much better job at, is continuing to build bridges and continuing to build dialogue with the U.S. so that we can have that truly North American approach to clean technology development. I think what we've seen is too often we get caught in the crossfire of some of these, frankly, overtly protectionist moves by the United States to shore up their own industries and clean tech industries. With respect to the report card that we issued, I think there's certainly a long way to go. And I think with everything in the space of developing our electric vehicle ecosystem in Canada, everything really needs to be done yesterday. And this is with respect to charging infrastructure, to the comments that Mr. Bilodeau made about expediting our environmental assessment process and processes to get mining on track. Really, there's a raft of things that need to be done as quickly as we possibly can. I think I would characterize overall that more needs to be done in terms of the report card. With respect to the fall economic statement itself, I would say that we appreciated the Clean Growth Fund and the opportunity, at least that was enunciated several times in the fall economic statement, to put in place initiatives to do whatever Canada can to be competitive to ensure that that clean tech drain does not go to the United States.
For your comments, and I'm extremely concerned. Mr. Poirier mentioned that there is a flight of capital to the U.S. We were told the fix is on the way and we have to craft a Canadian response, but it always seems that we're always running behind. Instead of being proactive, we're being reactive. And I was wondering if you could comment on something that comes across repeatedly. At the end of the day, it's going to be consumers that need to buy these electric cars. And the press release you put out in March of 2022, Mr. Roos, who is with the dealers, he said in order to do so, consumers will need to have the confidence that the products and the supporting infrastructure, including the ability to charge at home and work, meet their everyday needs. In the fall economic statement, can you point to anything that we could see to meet those charging needs and improving the grid? Because I believe we need 4 million of these charging stations. How are we doing with the response from the government in the fall economic statement in regard to charging?
Yeah, I can't point to anything particular in the fall economic statement myself, although I haven't taken that close a look at it for charging infrastructure, but I don't believe there was anything in that regard. However, I will go back to the government's commitments in the budget in terms of allocating $400 million to Natural Resources Canada and another $500 million to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to put in place 50,000 charging units. The concern there is that even with the initial amounts that have been afforded to Natural Resources Canada to put in around 35,000 pieces of charging infrastructure. To our understanding to date, only about 2,500 to 3,000 of those charging stations have been actually turned on and are operational and functional. So it's not only the speed in getting money out the door, it's the speed in actually getting the charging infrastructure put in place. And I think we can debate about what the number is, but I think we can certainly say that 50,000 pieces of charging infrastructure across the country are not enough. And the number is going to have to increase exponentially if we're going to be driving towards a situation where in 2030, 100%, or 2035 rather, 100% of all new vehicles are going to be zero emission vehicles. And even more critical as we move to 60% in 2030. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to build out that infrastructure.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you very
Mr.
much.
Carey, you've got 15 seconds left.
All right.
Mr. Arya, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sean Strickland, welcome to committee. I think this Thursday I'll be visiting one of your facilities to make an announcement on the apprentice service program. because the announcement has not been made, I will not comment on that now. Mr. Breton, welcome back. Nice seeing you again. During the last advocacy day, I didn't meet you, but I did meet the two of your members. Mr. David Biledo, I will come to you on the thing you mentioned about the mining projects, the time required from conceptualization to the actual production of a mining project takes around 7-10 plus years. And I want to pick your brains on the Ontario regional table that was recently announced. That's part of the 9 regional tables announced by the federal government jointly with provinces to have a joint work jointly on the resources, timelines, and the regulatory approaches to develop a critical mining, clean hydrogen, nuclear, and sustainable forestry. But before that, we are glad that we are talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. In my view, in addition to this act, we should also concurrently look at the CHIPS Act of 2022. It's called CHIPS and Science Act 2022, passed by the United States, which is a $280 billion legislation. Focus has always been on the chips production, but out of $280 billion, while $52 billion goes for the chip production, $200 million is going to regional technology centers to focus on not just the chips, but the energy technologies, biotechnology, etc. In my view, that act is basically a new industrial policy statement of US, and that will affect us if we don't focus on that too. So my view is that we have to look at both Inflation Reduction Act and the Chip and Science Act 2022. Canada, we are prosperous because of our trade. Trade accounts for 65% of our GDP. And as we all know, that is the US, which is a major trading partner. So our prosperity, our standard of living, everything is dependent on the trade with the United States, and that makes it very critical for us to look at things that is happening in the US and take measures. As Mr. Strickland, you did mention 2 things that are very important. You said that we can't respond line by line, which is very true. We can't match dollar for dollar every dollar that US invests. But as you mentioned, we have to respond smartly. And that is what Canada has been doing that in the last over 7 years as member of parliament and as a member of the state committee. I've been seeing that political parties, whether the Liberals, Conservatives, NDP or Bloc Québécois, we all work together when it comes to critical things that we have to deal with the United States and the trade with the United States, like we saw in the last NAFTA negotiations. Recently there was a report just 2 days back, I guess, a report on that U.S. military considers funding the Canadian mining companies. There was a lot of surprise that how come Pentagon is investing in Canadian mining companies, but many Canadians are not aware that Canadian companies are considered to be U.S. domestic companies for the defense purchases by the U.S. Pentagon for a long time. In fact, the defense production sharing agreement Canada has with the U.S. dates back to 1956. Now, under that, we are seeing the U.S. responding to the possible investment in critical minerals in Canada today, which is a good thing. Now, before coming to the Chamber of Commerce representative, Mr. Simard, I am glad that you are here. I have some a question not directly related to that, but this is my first opportunity to talk to you. The aluminum industry, we know, is key, is one of the critical minerals, but what I've been seeing is that during the last 15, 20 years, there is no increased production capacity in Canada. During the last 15, 20 years, we have been seeing new smelters coming up in other parts of the world, including the Middle East. But except for one small smelter, nothing new has come in. In fact, the production of aluminum in Canada from 2011, it was slightly below 3 million tons. Now, in 2020, the numbers I have is slightly more than 3 million tons. Basically, we are stagnant in the capacity to produce aluminum. Maybe the reason is that out of the 10 aluminum smelters we have, 9 are owned by just Rio Tinto and Alcoa. Is the foreign ownership, does the foreign ownership of Canadian aluminum companies consider Canada as just as a branch office to cater only to the United States, because 90% of your production goes to United States as export, while we have signed a free trade agreement with European Union. We got CAPTT with the Pacific nations. So why are we not seeing aluminum production, installed capacity of aluminum production going up so that we can use cheap and clean Canadian power that is available to produce aluminum and export to Europe and Asia Pacific countries?
Mr. Arya, you
Madam Chair?
have 23 seconds remaining in your time, sir. So I'm not quite sure how any of those witnesses are possibly going to.
Il n'y a pas d'interprétation, Madame la Présidente.
China over the planet aluminium in the past 15 years. They went from 10% of the world's production to 56% of the world's total production. They've taken over the markets with subsidized metal. Today, 76% of the world's aluminium production capacity is state-sponsored around the world. We have 3 world-class producers in Canada that are public companies, not state-owned, not subsidized, like it's the case in China. And over those 15 years, the U.S. has lost most of its production capacity, and so has Europe. In Canada, we've invested $15 billion at those same years to modernize our plants. That's the situation.
Thank you very much for that great answer. You put it all in a very brief few seconds, the answer that we thought you were going to give us. On to Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Oui, merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have some questions. After all, you are our witnesses. We're here to hear you. Thank you to all of our guests. Mr. Breton, first question. We've been led to believe that in the economic statement presented 2 weeks ago, there would be compensation, and this in regard to the Inflation Reduction Act. Do you think it was sufficient, or do you think we need to put pressure on the United States to change the bill?
En fait, moi je crois.
I believe that if we want genuine partners, just like President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau talked about in 2021 about developing a battery industry, it would mean that you wouldn't have to manufacture the batteries in the United States to get any of these discounts. It's as if the United States is saying, well, you know, the products with added value are going to be manufactured in the United States. That's going to reproduce a business model that we've had in recent decades, let alone centuries. The raw materials come from Canada, be it aluminium, oil, and then all of value-added products are manufactured in the U.S. So some 89% of lithium goes straight to China. So I supported the Canadian government when it said we have to limit access to our critical minerals for national security reasons. And I'm talking about electric vehicles, but also others. We can't just dig holes and then send products elsewhere. So we need strategic thinking when it comes to managing our resources. And there are many other sectors that are of vital importance as well. Now, if you draw a parallel between this and Build Back Better, which was adopted, but there was a litigious provision, and there was a lot of media attention to that as compared to this Inflation Reduction Act. But with that, there was a clear problem. Companies would have to relocate to benefit from these incentives. Now, that changed. Now, I wonder if it will, pass the court tests. But right now, what could we modify? if we were to say one thing to the United States and how to change this act, what should that change be? Well, I think it would be that it cannot be manufactured in the U.S. It would need to be manufactured in North America under CUSMA. David Adams represents auto builders, but we represent all kinds of transportation type vehicles. So if they want access to a subsidy for a light or heavy electric vehicle, they find themselves in a situation where Canada won't be competitive, and that's a problem. So what would be the consequences for infrastructures? Well, for infrastructures, and I'll be in complete disagreement with what was recently said with regard to new infrastructures in Canada. But I want to give you the example of Quebec. 45% of vehicles that are chargeable with 45% of these vehicles, we have some 9,000 public charging facilities. Global Automakers and Canadian Vehicle Association, the kinds of public charge, it makes no sense. We're at 150,000 electric vehicles in June of 2022 in Quebec. In 2030, the government wants 1.6 million, so multiply by 10. So, signed up 90,000 charging installations in Quebec. And I'm talking public. So that is a figure that's in keeping with the figures published by Natural Resources a few weeks ago, that would need some 50,000 public charging facilities. And these figures rest on facts. And Quebec and BC are the two provinces of Canada where the recharging installations are most robust. So with the Congress's proposal, how will that have an impact? Well, what's being proposed for infrastructure deployment, Canada is actually ahead of that proposal compared to the U.S. But what worries me much more is the manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries, because it would force builders to go to the U.S. to have access to that, be it light or heavy vehicles. In 30 seconds, I can only thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bacharach for 6 minutes, please.
Very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses for their presentations. This is a fascinating discussion. Perhaps I'll start with Mr. Breton for my questions. You mentioned I think it was you that mentioned the $15 billion in battery-related investment in Canada in recent years, which is certainly positive news.
It's not battery. It's vehicles,
the
battery,
whole supply chain.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet, currently, to my knowledge, Canada doesn't have a concerted strategy around the zero-emission vehicle and battery supply chain. Is there a need for a Government of Canada strategy to lead that important work?
Yeah, actually, I think we need a full electric mobility strategy altogether, concerning all the departments. 10 years ago, when I was in government for the Government of Quebec, we had, I would say, an inclusive battery electric mobility strategy going from infrastructure to research and development to vehicle manufacturing to education and training, because this is very important, because we want to have workers who know what to do with electric cars. So yes, this is needed. This is something that we've talked about for a number of years, and we have some catching up to do, not just to the U.S. I'll just give you a number here when we're talking about battery manufacturing or electric vehicle manufacturing. From Bloomberg New Energy Finance, China currently holds 75% of all battery cell manufacturing capacity and 90% of anode and electrolyte production. So we have a lot of years of catching up to do towards China. They are far ahead of us. So I see that the Inflation Reduction Act is making a difference, but Canada has to catch up with the U.S. and China especially.
So just following up on that, we heard from Mr. Adams that in his opinion, Canada should follow suit on the incentives, but not the restrictions around domestic content. Do you share that view?
Absolutely not. Because actually, when we're talking about restrictions, we're talking about ZEV mandate, for instance. We've been advocating for a ZEV mandate. The government of Canada has announced that it wanted to adopt a ZEV mandate by beginning of 2023 or something like that, because we need EV supply. And I can give you an example. Back in 2011, we gave money to Toyota to build electric vehicles, the Toyota RAV4 EV in Ontario, 70 million from the federal, 70 million from the Ontario government. Because there was no regulation, no obligation for them to sell the EVs in Canada, and there was regulation in the U.S. to sell them, 100% of these EVs were sent to the U.S. because there was regulation over there.
I want to hop in with some questions for Mr. Strickland. The inclusion of requirements around good union wages, around apprenticeships, I think this is something that really sets the Inflation Reduction Act apart from the work that Canada has done already. How much would it take? What would it take for Canada to emulate those aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thank you for the question. I think it'd be fairly easy that you just, through regulation or through the process of applying for a tax credit, that application includes a commitment from the proponent that they are going to create good union-paying jobs, and also make a commitment to apprenticeship. So, I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't think it would require a lot. And I'll also say that in terms of creating good union jobs and adopting prevailing wage strategies, this is good for all workers. It's good for union work, but it's good for all workers. So I think it's important to consider that these tax credits, subsidies in exchange for the creation of good union jobs benefit all workers, because we're going to do as much of that work as we possibly can, but it's going to benefit the entire industry.
Mr. Strickland, I read somewhere that the IRA really shows that the United States' approach to decarbonization is industrial strategy. I wonder if, in your opinion, we can say the same thing about Canada's approach to emissions reduction.
Well, I think up until the Inflation Reduction Act, I would say that Canada was doing a very good job, and Canada continues to do a very good job, just in terms of my daily business and talking with proponents of major infrastructure projects. There's hydrogen projects in Newfoundland that are approaching final investment decision. Hydrogen projects in Alberta. We have LNG projects right across Canada. So there's a lot of interest. EV production in Windsor, Ontario, more EV battery plants to come in Ontario. So I think that we've been doing a really good job, but we need to take stock of our approach to all these incentives in light of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that would be wise on behalf of the government and parliamentarians to take a look at it. And as I said, be very strategic in responding in ways that make sense and amplify our competitive advantage that we have already in some of these sectors.
Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. And like my colleague earlier who led off the round, I'm just going to discuss, and probably Mr. Adams and Mr. Bilodeau, the questions with regards to how Canada responds. I mean, a previous witness from our last hearing, Ms. Cobden from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, basically said the IRA takes an enabling approach. And during her question and answer period, she juxtaposed that with Canada having more of a carrot and stick approach. And what it's doing, I mean, you're seeing $390 billion that's been offered over a 10-year investment. It's just driving. We have auto manufacturing facilities close by. And, selfishly, we'd like to see those facilities continue to exist and expand to meet those demands. But when you see some of those production credits, those content requirements, to Mr. Bilodeau, we even have the ability to meet some of those demands. And when I look at one of these credits in the United States and it has to have a specified production limit for critical minerals, they're talking about, going from 40% in 2023 to 50% in 2024 to 60% in 2025. 2026 and 80% in 2027. How does Canada even meet that demand? We can't get a mine built in 10 years. How are we going to be able to compete to draw those critical minerals so that we can get those production facilities? It's tough enough that the Americans are now actually offering production credits as well and multiplier effects. So how does Canada compete? Mr. Adams, you had mentioned that you're going to be providing recommendations to the Finance Committee. Do you have some suggestions that you could provide for us now, or at least share them with us when you table those with the Finance Committee?
Mr. Adams, your microphone's off. Okay. Please start. Please start again.
Sorry about that. Yes, be happy to share those recommendations with you when we do present them to the Finance Committee. I mean, you raise a critical point that really what's happening in the U.S., and I think others in the panel would agree with me, is that you're absolutely right. It is an industrial strategy that's being applied to address climate change and address greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And we need the same approach here, a comprehensive approach. One of the things we do need to leverage is private investment into this effort as well, in that government is not going to be able to do this all by itself. So we need to find creative ways to leverage private investment to assist in making this happen. Maybe I'll turn it over to Mr. Bilodeau for his comments as well.
Yeah, if I may. So the Canadian Chamber of Commerce recently released a report on Canada's commitment to net zero and how we get to our 2050 goal in an orderly fashion. I'd be happy to share that report with the committee after our discussion today. Similarly, we have an upcoming report focused on critical minerals, which is focused on addressing every section of our supply chain, from upstream exploration and extraction to downstream manufacturing and recycling. We're going to be developing a number of recommendations in each of those areas. Those will be released early December. Happy again to share those findings with the committee. But whether it's looking at net zero or critical minerals, life sciences, or digital economy, when the Chamber examines these potential areas for growth, there's always two themes that crop up that impede Canada's ambitions to grow: access to capital and access to labor. The government of Canada is already making great strides in access to capital through investments made by the Canada Infrastructure Bank, through the CIIT, most recently through the Clean Fuel Fund. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at net zero alone, we're looking at a $2 trillion price tag for Canada to decarbonize. So we really need to start getting serious about the true cost behind not only extracting and processing critical minerals, but also decarbonizing our economy. Similarly with labor, we're already facing labor shortages, which makes it really hard to attract investments in Canada. So we need to start developing that green job strategy I mentioned in my opening remarks.
And just building on that,
You have 12 seconds, actually.
Well, just building on that, and you talk about, how we get that enabling approach. I mean, that would also extend, I guess, to our regulatory approach here in Canada, so that we can be better able to foster that investment and that job creation than to kind of hinder it away and send it to the United States.
If there's a short answer.
I 100% agree. It's very hard to attract investment.
Go ahead, Mr. Bilodeau.
Sorry, it's very hard to attract investment, particularly in the critical mineral sector, when our timelines go up to 15 years to start production. We need to shorten that time span to attract major investment capital.
Thank you very much, sir. On to Mr. Varani for 5 minutes.
So, thank you, merci beaucoup. I want to start with Monsieur Breton. You had commented on, in response to what's been discussed about electric vehicle charging station infrastructure. I thought of such vehicles will be charging at home, thus reducing the number of public vehicle charging infrastructure that we have. So you're nodding, so I guess I understood you well in terms of that. Can you tell me, you indicated that BC and Quebec have already had substantial success in building up vehicle charging infrastructure. Can you connect that to the idea about the provincial tax credits that are available in the province of Quebec, and if you have the understanding what's available in British Columbia? Is there a connection between those two? Yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, there is connection, meaning that it shows that both those provinces are serious about making sure that more and more people adopt electric vehicles, compared to other provinces where there are neither any incentive to buy one or any will to develop a serious EV infrastructure. But to your point, you have to keep in mind that more and more people from more and more companies from the private sector are investing in EV infrastructure. I'll give you an example. One of our new members, which is called Parkland, Parkland's owned a significant percentage of gas stations in Canada. So they've decided to invest in EV infrastructure across the country. Circle K, I'm sure you know Circle K. This is one of the biggest companies in the world coming from Canada, Circle K Couche-Tard, and now they are one of the biggest infrastructure provider in Europe. So when you have private companies working with provinces, working with the federal government to develop all some infrastructure program, I think that we are on the right path. I mean, we have to do more, obviously, but I think that we're in much better shape than some other countries are. But I think that the leaders, we have to look at what's happening in Quebec and BC because they've really taken the lead on EV infrastructure.
I mean, I note that with the change of government in Ontario in 2018, a very substantial EV tax credit was eliminated entirely by the incoming administration of Doug Ford. And I think, would you agree that that was a step backwards in terms of incentivizing not only the purchase of electric vehicles, but also the corollary supports or supplemental supports, such as the charging infrastructure?
No, I don't agree. It was 2 steps backwards.
Fair enough. So I want to move.
But it was beyond the EV rebates. You also had the whole plan to deploy EV infrastructure that was stopped at the same time. So that was a big blow.
Okay, so I want to turn to Mr. Strickland and Mr. Simard. Both of you mentioned, Mr. Strickland in particular, you mentioned, the two of you both mentioned in terms of what is aggressive in the IRA, you both highlighted nuclear. And you know in the fall economic statement, there's a statement about the clean growth, the investment tax credit, which I believe is part of the clean growth fund of up to 30% being available for things like small modular reactors. There's a statement that follows a little bit later about exploring large nuclear capacity as well. Can you comment on your views on the availability of such tax credits and other financial incentives on the part of the federal government towards nuclear, broadly speaking, not just small?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I would say that part of my comments have always been centered around pursuing our competitive advantage in terms of responding to IRA. And I think that nuclear is one of our competitive advantages. We have a strong track record of nuclear in Ontario. We have a strong track record of nuclear in New Brunswick. And then over and above that, there's this emerging technology of small modular reactors. And small modular reactors have a variety of different uses, and not only powering the grid, but also powering large industrial applications. So, for example, mining. Most Canadians aren't aware of the thousands and thousands of liters of diesel that are helicoptered into our north to provide, fuel for mining operations. Well, there'd be an opportunity for a small modular reactor to replace that, and reduce the number of emissions and so on. So I think nuclear energy, small modular reactor, and traditional nuclear is a competitive advantage we have in Canada, and we should leverage that to whatever extent we can to increase our nuclear capacity.
And I would just say to you, given your sort of hat is with the Canadian Building Trades Union, it's also a typical point where you have things like Bruce Power or Ontario, very high-paying unionized jobs.
All good-paying union jobs, and all the proponents for small modular reactors in Canada are signing MOUs with unions to make sure those are built using union labor as well.
Now, I'm struck by one of the things. Really?
Sorry.
I started my time late.
Take some of Chandra's time.
Yeah, I'll take some of China's. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Earlier, I found interesting the divergent views concerning infrastructure from the two associations. Both have members for the production of electric vehicles. I'd like to ask Mr. Adams and Mr. Breton, who are your members? I just want to understand. I'm trying to understand the reason for such diverging opinions. Thank you.
Je peux commencer?
Can I begin? As I said, amongst our members, we have a number who manufacture light and heavy electric vehicles, companies that manufacture either electric vehicles or components such as Tesla, New Flyer, Girardin, Nova Bus, Taiga. I don't know if you've noted, it's been named as one of the inventions of the year by Time magazine a few days ago. Add energy. So we have a number of members. In fact, the majority of our members manufacture either electric vehicles or the components for. And that's for Canada. And what about for Mr. Adams? I'm interested in members in Canada, of course. Thank you.
Well, all of our members are members in Canada. However, we have two manufacturers, Honda and Toyota. The remainder of our 15 members are the traditional European manufacturers, German manufacturers, the Korean manufacturers, and the Japanese manufacturers as well. We also have VinFast, which is a Vietnamese electric vehicle company that's an associate member of the association as well.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Bacharach for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have some questions for Mr. Simard. As you know, I believe the only aluminum smelter in Canada outside of Quebec is in Northwest BC. There's about 1,000 people in Kitimat who rely on it for their employment, a really important facility that was just modernized a few years back. I wonder if you could speak to the people of that community and share your thoughts on what the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States could mean for aluminum production in Kitimat 5-10 years down the road.
Well, I would say that it means the same as for the rest of the industry in Canada, the other primary smelters, because it's all a matter of supply and demand in North America. And the Kitimat plant is certainly a world-class operation that ships into two markets, which is Asia and North America. There will be an increase in the growth of demand for aluminium that will be pulled by the IRA. And all depending on the products that are generated or manufactured out of Kitimat, they will be able to capture some of that increase in demand. It's all a market play at the same time. Canada is not the only exporting country to the U.S. We are competing with the Middle East. We are competing with India, with some Asian countries. They're all high carbon. We have the lowest carbon footprint in the world. So that's an edge looking at a decarbonization of the U.S. Industrial sector. Kitimat certainly has an edge on competition.
I'll cede my time back to you, Madam Chair, at risk of trying to fit in one more question.
Okay, Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very pleased that you are able to be here. Mr. Simard, regarding the aluminum industry in Quebec, you said that the legislation such as the IRA could be good for aluminum and create opportunities. But in a recent article, you said that the Canadian aluminum plants hardly reduce capacity. So what is lacking from the Canadian government to actually foster investment to be able to increase the production capacity of our aluminum facilities? Thank you for that excellent question, Mr. Martel. Here I'm going to draw a connection between a question posed by one of your colleagues. We have already experienced a modernization wave in the last 15 years in Canada, in our plants. The average age of our Canadian plants are 35 years. When you look at the date of construction historically, which means that today we are at a turning point where we have to consider a new wave of investments. And we're talking about billions in investment because some of these plants are huge. So we have a paradox. Yes, there's an increase in market demand. Yes, we're well positioned, as I explained at the outset, in terms of carbon footprint and even human footprint. But the question we have to wonder about if you have to invest billions is, am I going to draw up an investment plan with current technologies, or shall I wait and invest with the kind of technology that's actually going to bring me into the future for the next 25 of the fiscal system to attract big industrial investment and to eliminate the risk for this type of investment. We're going to need more and more automation, artificial intelligence, the kind of machinery that will be developed here in Canada, here in Quebec, to respond to those needs. But we can't do that with the fiscal regime we have today. It's going to need accelerated appreciation of capital, the CapEx. It's also going to need reorganization to be able to invest in decarbonization. But there's still work to be done there. Microphone, please. So the federal government reception, how welcoming is the government? Well, we say the same thing every day during pre-budget consultations, and we're still waiting. The same for the Quebec government. Quebec has made some arrangements, but I would say that the most important parameter is the acceleration of depreciation, which we're not entitled to as an industrial sector. Well, people then wonder, what is going on? What are these conversations? Well, if you'll allow me, I'd like to add, we say, how can Canada, deal with the IRA in the States? We don't have the clout. We're not big enough. We don't have the means. But at least we can try to make a difference and focus on our assets, our natural competitive edge, and aluminum is one. We need to be more agile. We need to accelerate industrialization in Canada. We can't take 12 years to carry out a huge project. We need to change the regulatory environment so that we can transform faster than the U.S. Regulatory changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses appearing today. First, I'd like to ask Mr. Strickland. apprenticeship program. Can you expand a little on the success of this program, and do you think it could help the Canadian companies retain workers and grow their business going forward?
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question, and it's been alluded to previously by other witnesses that we have a labor availability challenge in Canada in a variety of different sectors. One of them is construction. We bring in thousands of apprentices every year through the unionized industry just to keep pace with retirements. Then when you overlay that with all the possibilities of future work, we need some help. We need some help to attract people into the trades. And in the trades is a program through ESDC Canada where we are able to incentivize employers to hire apprentices. So they'll be able to receive $5,000 for an apprentice and $10,000 if that apprentice is from an equity deserving group.
Thank you for that. And next questions I'd like to address to Mr. Adam. This past spring, along with a number of other automotive industry associations in Canada, your organization launched a new initiative aimed at helping Canadians understand what it takes for Canada to achieve its zero-emission vehicle sales target, the road to 2035. I'm wondering if you can share with the Standing Committee your thoughts on our government's commitment in the Fall Economic Statement, and if you can elaborate on what more you think needed to be done to level the playing field with the United States.
Thanks very much for the question. With respect to the road to 2035, I think we are putting that ourselves, and as you mentioned, the other automotive associations are putting that out to assist not only Canadian consumers, but also Canadian legislators in terms of what needs to be done to facilitate this change. That has a lot to do with incentives, as I've already mentioned. It also has a lot to do with infrastructure. I think with respect to your question in terms of the Fall Economic Statement, the Canada Growth Fund, the accelerated capital cost reduction, I believe it was, are two elements that could potentially assist, but I think the reality is that we need to see a little bit more detail, and we understand that will be forthcoming in the budget. But as myself and other speakers have already alluded to, the budget is probably some 5 months away, and every month counts in the space that we're operating in.
Thank you. And the next question I would like to address to Mr. Brenton. The relationship between the federal and provincial government on EV policy has proven to be challenging at times. And can you expand on how you think that the federal and provincial government can best work together when it comes to any EV policies?
Thank you for the question. Well, as we can see, we are looking at what's being done in Quebec and BC, but also in Atlantic provinces regarding accelerating EV adoption through rebates, infrastructure deployment. We are seeing that provinces who are willing to move forward in that direction make a big difference. So the federal government cannot do it by itself. So we need all the provinces to move on in that same direction. So now we have this, the central provinces from Ontario to Alberta, where there are no rebates. There is starting to be an infrastructure deployment plan in Ontario. In other provinces, it's still a challenge, especially when you move outside of the urban areas. Let's say you move in rural Manitoba or Saskatchewan, for instance. This is more of a challenge. So, we have members across the country who are working with municipal government because sometimes provincial government do not want to move forward in that direction. So we're looking at all levels of government to make sure that we accelerate EV adoption. So I would say that in some provinces who are not too keen on accelerating EV adoption, we're very often working with the municipal governments.
Thank you, and I'm
30
proud.
seconds.
Well, a comment I'd like to make, proud to become a British Columbian. That is at the forefront of the EV policy, and
Absolutely.
I hope there's more provinces joining us.
Thanks.
later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fast for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much to all of our witnesses. My first question is to Mr. Adams. I just wanted to get clarity on the state of Canada's clean vehicle environment, not only on the industrial and the job creation side, those are important, but also on the consumer side. Did you say that 85% of all Canadian EV production is exported?
Mr. Adams, your mic is off. Thank you.
Sorry, I said I think 85% of production is currently exported. We would expect that that would be the case when vehicles are electrified as well, that the majority of the production would go to the United States.
Okay, so with the incentives that the IRA now establishes, which will presumably increase the demand for ZEVs in the United States, will that not exacerbate the problem of having more and more of Canadian production exported and Canadians being left without the availability of zero emission vehicles for purchase?
Actually, I don't think so. I think at least in the short term, it will likely be exactly the opposite, because I think as other speakers have noted, it will take a lot of time for the capacity to be built up in the United States to meet the provisions under which a consumer can access the rebate with respect to both critical minerals and battery production. So right now, whereas 70 models used to be eligible for the EV incentive, there will only be currently about 20 or 25 eligible for the incentive in the United States. So I guess you could also build an argument that in that circumstance, if there are an abundance of EVs out there, which there currently are not, that Canada might have an advantage in securing more EVs because of the both the federal and in some cases the provincial incentive that are in place.
So would you acknowledge that Canada presently has a shortage of EVs available for purchase by Canadian consumers?
I would say that there's a shortage of all vehicles, whether they're EV or ICE vehicles currently with respect to EVs. The reality is it's not one country versus another. The reality is that the world is transitioning and building up both battery facilities and vehicle production facilities, and this will take time for more robust allocations of vehicles to be available on a global basis.
I've got a question for all of our witnesses. Jump in if you can. Is there anything in the IRA and its incentives for EV and battery production that would violate either our trade agreement with the US, USMCA, or the WTO trade rules?
Well, that's a question I'm asking myself, actually. In my initial presentation, I did mention this because the fact that, they're giving incentive for U.S. battery production only, I think can be a concern. So I think it is something to look into.
And I would suggest that that would also be the case for any responses that our Canadian government comes forward with. We have to make sure that we comply with our trade obligations, both under the USMCA and the WTO. A question to Mr. Bilodeau. The IRA introduces $500 billion Canadian in new spending, and that's on top of several $1 trillion worth of U.S. spending that occurred during the COVID pandemic. Has your organization done any analysis of the impact this additional spending will have on inflation in Canada? I mean, we know that when the United States spends, that spending often sloshes over the Canadian border. Have you done any analysis whether that will have an impact on our inflationary pressures?
So maybe two quick points, and if I could respond to your previous question real quick. It's worth noting that the European Union is carefully examining whether the Inflation Reduction Act does violate WTO rules. A number of tax credits, I believe inclusive of electric vehicle tax credits, might indeed violate those WTO rules. So I would keep a close eye on the actions of the European Union on that file. To your second question regarding inflationary pressures, this is an area of focus the Chamber is currently examining. We already know that inflationary pressures are making labor conditions in Canada much worse. So with the added pressure of the 9 million anticipated jobs being created by the Inflation Reduction Act, labor conditions are going to be exacerbated. And I suspect cost of operating will also be a challenge as well going forward.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Sheehan, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all our presenters. This is really good information for us to have. As you know, what a difference a day makes. I mean, at the beginning, when we were discluded from many of the Buy American strategies, it sort of reminded me again of the 232 tariffs that were launched on steel and aluminum and that kind of protectionism. But we know that our economies are so integrated. You know, I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, a good steel town, and we were on the front lines of the first round. So I thought it was like deja vu all over again. So my first question is I won't go further than this guy on that, but I'm going to ask my friend from the aluminum producers about the CIIT programming, because we heard testimony how important CIIT programming is, the Strategic Innovation Fund, to the steel industry. So, Jean, I would like to ask about the CIIT funding, and did you take advantage of it? Could you use more of it, I guess, is the question to you first.
Thank you. We have been using the CIIT program. The first iteration of the CIIT program lacked in our evaluation the required agility, speed of delivery, but it worked. This is what backed the ELYSIS project initially to develop the inert anode, which will bring us to produce without any CO2 emissions in the future. So it's been very strategic to the aluminium industry. We are still benefiting for other projects in the industry from the CIIT program. We think it's a very well-designed program. It's WTO compliant. It's accessible. It's probably a little burdensome in terms of paperwork, of follow-up and everything. But it's big sums of money at the same time, so it has to be proved. Well proved to ensure that the citizens' money is well invested, well spent. So it's of all the things that lie around the federal landscape in terms of programs, this certainly is one of the jewel of the crown.
Merci beaucoup. Mr. Strickland, before I was MP, I used to work for the Ministry of Training, College, Universities, and I was the T in that. So I did a lot with apprenticeship. There was a few announcements recently, including the labor mobility, tax credit for people, particularly in the construction industry. Could you make some comments on it? It's a $4,000 fund for those that are listening. And I think that it's really good because you can have people moving all across the country to where the work is. And so some comments on that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. The labor mobility tax deduction, which treats a worker more fairly than what a tax credit would. So we were really pleased that that tax deduction was included in the last federal budget. Previously, construction workers weren't allowed to deduct travel expenses for going to work, accommodation, when they had to travel for work. So they weren't able to deduct those expenses like many other Canadians are allowed to deduct those expenses. So we're really pleased to see that change. We've been working on that change for quite some time. So it will help improve mobility so that workers can go to where the work is and put in that claim when their living expenses aren't covered by a collective agreement, because there are some collective agreements that will cover those living expenses. So we're pleased with that. We also, there'll be lots of comments about the fall economic statement. And in the fall economic statement, there was discussions around enhanced credits for a variety of initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases, which also included language around prevailing wage and creating good middle-class jobs, and also supporting apprenticeship. So, there's a whole host of avenues that we need and policy levers that we need to address labor availability and labor mobility in Canada, and we're pleased with some of these developments that have occurred.
And tying it in with the green, I think, is really good, too, as well in the fall economic statement. So thank you for that. Union
34
training.
34 seconds.
Okay. So the union training, the doubling of the union training, can you describe what kind of impact that would make in 30 seconds?
Well, union training innovation programs had tremendous impact in terms of tens of millions of dollars in investment in union training centers across Canada, which we have over 195 of them. And we invest over $250 million of industry funds to train journey people and also apprentices. And the Union Training Innovation Program has helped us purchase more equipment to help us position our workers for the new technologies of the future to help with decarbonization.
Thank you. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So this goes back to my previous round of questions. I want to ask you, all of you, in one sentence, if you wanted to, push the U.S. government or a change or an improvement. Mr. Breton, you said change the American for North American. So I ask to all of you my same question.
En 2 minutes environ.
Maximum 2 minutes for all of you.
Pour ma part,
As far as I'm concerned, either use the North American label or signatory countries of CUSMA. We can't change the free trade agreement, but maybe refer to it at least.
Who have done a much deeper dive into the different segments of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I would put a different spin on it. What we need to do in response is adopt some of the language to make sure we create good union paying and good middle class jobs.
I guess I would say that we need to be strategic, as other commentators have made, about where we leverage our investments. Certainly, perhaps increasing the SIF funding, those types of measures to allow us to be strategic in how we try and secure investment for Canada. To Mr. Fast's point, I think we do need to be careful of our trade obligations internationally as well.
And maybe I'll just echo some of the previous comments. I think that focus really should be on the Canadian response to the Inflation Reduction Act and how we go about not only continuing to collaborate with the United States, but addressing some of these non-tariff barriers to the U.S. market. Federal subsidies for things like CCUS are basically about half in Canada of what's now on offer in the United States. So it's time to get moving on our response here.
I would add one thing with regard to government tendering. Rather than go with the lowest bid, you have green offerings, federal or provincial, and that does not go against international trade agreements. And I think it'd be important that Canada move in that direction because we would be advanced.
Chair. Mr. Breton, the Inflation Reduction Act includes a $4,000 tax credit for used zero-emission vehicles. How does that compare to incentives in Canada for used zero-emission vehicles?
Well, in one of the mandate letters, we are supposed to see a used EV rebate coming up soon. So we are advocating for people who don't want to buy or just cannot buy a brand new electric vehicle to be able to have one through an EV rebate for used vehicles. So I think it's been out there for a couple of years now. So we're hoping that at one point the federal government will come up with a used EV rebate.
And have you had conversations with the federal government about when that incentive is coming for used EVs? I know right now used electric vehicles are selling for more than the price of a new electric vehicle because there's such constraints on supply. What has the federal government told you about when that's coming?
No word yet regarding when that's coming, but we are expecting the news, I would say, in the 2023 budget.
Thank you. And Mr. Simard, I was interested to hear you mention the ELYSIS project to move towards zero-carbon aluminum production. Very exciting. I know that that work is supported through various programs, as you mentioned. Is there anything in the Inflation Reduction Act that incentivizes the rollout of that technology throughout Canada's aluminum sector?
You mean to what extent is there something in the IRA that is applicable to what is being done in Canada?
my read of the IRA is that it creates a large demand for North American aluminum, but the Elysis project is specifically about driving down the carbon content of that aluminum. Is there anything in the Act that is going to expedite or accelerate the rollout of these zero carbon technologies?
I don't think it will. Excuse me. I don't think it will impact in such a fashion what's going on in Canada. I think there is something in the Act, and we have to look into it a little in a more granular fashion that might shore into the U.S. industrial complex part of the manufacturing required to produce some of the components of that technology.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes.
5 minutes, oui.
5 minutes. I will share my time if I run out of questions. Mr. Breton, what concerns me right now is there doesn't seem to be anything that happens. We talk about things, nothing changes. Now, for, your association, I expect you've been doing a lot of lobbying of the Canadian government. Now, what kind of support have you asked for in recent years with a view to developing a strong fleet of EVs in Canada? I started these discussions with the government 18 years ago. That's not yesterday. And just as I've said before, China is years ahead of everyone on the planet, not just Canada, because in Europe, in the US, Korea, Japan, no one was interested. Suddenly, everybody's waking up. So we have a lot of catching up to do. And to be honest, in the last couple of years, the Canadian government has done a lot to adopt EVs. You've got the rebates, then an announcement for the rebate for the purchase of a medium and heavy EV, that announcement last summer, and then infrastructure deployment. It's true that the figures don't hold water. We need more charging infrastructure. The federal government can't do it alone, and that's why the provincial governments, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Maritime provinces, BC, are working hard in this regard. R&D. You must never forget, if you take the test of 2020, there's the LFP test. Where was that developed? In Quebec. And the Hydro-Quebec Institute. And the MNC technology developed under Jeff Dan at Dalhousie. So we have the experts, we have the scientists. So what we need is a plan to integrate all this. And this, I turn to my colleague. We need skilled workers that will be able to transition from declining industry to those industries that are developing and very quickly. And for that, we have a lot of work to do. I'll give the floor to my colleague, Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Martel. I'd like to address a question to Mr. Bilodeau because from a business standpoint, the federal government puts these targets out without any clear pathways. And when you talk about, we've been talking about provincial partnerships, sometimes each province has a different challenge. We've talked about subsidization, and that may not be something that all provinces can do equally. Mr. Bilodeau, I was wondering if you could expand on your comment about non-tariff barriers and how the federal government, if you could give the federal government some advice for us provided to the committee. The fall economic statement really fell short. And could you comment on how to improve our competitiveness? And because we can't subsidize more than the United States, but how do we attract better capital? How do we improve our labor options and training for the future labor we need? You talked about lead times for mining and supply chains. I know that's a lot in 2.5 minutes, but if you don't get to it, if you could send some information to us, advice for the government, because we really want to work together to make sure that we send a path forward that's clear so we can attract that investment here in this country.
Great question. So maybe starting first with the fall economic statement, the Canadian Chamber welcomed measures to increase the supply of skills needed in our workforce to achieve net zero. We also welcome tax credits for investments in clean technologies and clean hydrogen. as well as the commitment to reducing regulatory obstacles to investment in many major projects. But that being said, we really had hoped to see low-cost growth measures, like a plan to eliminate long-standing barriers to interprovincial trade and to substantially materially reduce regulatory burdens in several sectors, inclusive of the mining sector. The Chamber also wanted to see in the fall economic statement, and we're hoping to see this going forward, an integrated plan to get desperately needed food, fuel, and fertilizer to global markets. So, at a high level, our initial response is that the fall economic statement is indeed a start. But as many of my colleagues on the panel today have said, it looks like we're going to need to wait until budget 2023 to receive a sustainable economic growth plan that covers all of these sectors. But again, at the core of what the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is looking for is low-cost options to support economic growth, like addressing the interprovincial trade barriers, but also supporting labor growth, including skilled labor growth, and increasing and directing incentives to where they need to be. Thanks.
Thank
Any
you
time,
very
or is that
much.
it?
Yes, your time is up, sir. On to Mr. Varani, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to return back to Monsieur Breton. So we've heard a lot about investments that have been made in the electric vehicle sector, particularly in the last sort of year or so, and the number of 15 billion has come up. And I know among that 15 billion, there was a announcement of a planned investment by Umicore of 1.5 billion in a net zero facility that's dedicated to producing the essential components of EV batteries and creating 1,000 jobs in the construction sector. So dovetailing with some of the just transition points that Mr. Strickland was making. But the broad theme I'm getting from all of the witnesses here is that we can't just replicate the old resource-based economy model of Canada. We need to be doing more of this fabrication. So this Umicore investment is along the right path. Can you elaborate on how we get more of that on the fabrication side, and what impediments need to be removed, or what incentives need to be put in place for fabrication of the batteries themselves?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is having quite an effect on the possibility of Canada to attract new players to build batteries and battery components in Canada. So I think that's something that we really have to look into. Let's be honest here. Minister Champagne has been doing an amazing job at attracting investment in Canada, whether it's for batteries, vehicles, components, anodes, cathodes. But it is a challenge. But there is one more thing that I would like to mention, because we've talked about the fact that mining, working to develop a mining industry that's going to be towards net zero, decarbonizing the economy. So many of the critical minerals do need a lot of time, too much time as far as we are concerned, to being opened and authorized and start producing. But we need to have, refining done as well here, because people don't realize that. But what's happening in China is that many of the critical minerals do not come from China, but they're bought by China and they're being refined in China. So we have to develop a refining industry here that's going to be a lot more thriving than what we have seen in the past. And my colleague here from the aluminum industry was mentioning that exactly. But we also have to make sure that we work in partnership, and I want to emphasize that work partnership with the First Nations, because we cannot replicate the same mistakes that we've done in the past, coming on their land and saying, well, we're opening this mine here and there, and we'll see how we compensate you afterwards. And to me, this is a critical issue, because if we do not address that right from the beginning, I think it's going to be a major roadblock.
And that dovetails with this issue about, yes, there's regulations and requirements for a mining project, but they're necessary for inclusive growth and growth that doesn't actually demean or diminish First Nations rights. Mr. Strickland, I want to turn back to you. At the very start, you talked about Canada's leadership position and what we were doing in terms of net zero and sort of climate action. And you said, in one fell swoop, the IRA, they're leaping in front of us and we have to keep pace. And I'm going to say to you that we've heard a lot about it at this committee and generally in Parliament about the carrot and the stick approach, right? The carrot is what we're seeing in the United States in terms of active incentives, huge dollar amounts, 5-fold increases that you mentioned. The stick, which I also believe spurs innovation, particularly as we move on a path towards net zero, are things like our price on pollution, a carbon price, which has been a hallmark of our government. I believe it needs to be a twofold approach. I'll confess to you some surprise when people like the Biden administration are saying to us, you need to show more ambition, and then there are parliamentarians, including on the floor of the House of Commons, that say, get rid of the carbon price or stop accelerating the carbon price. I think it needs to be a multifaceted approach. Can you comment on that?
Well, I would agree that it needs to be a multifaceted approach, in terms of the carrot and the stick, and in terms of providing incentives. There's the Canadian way and there's the U.S. way, and we usually find a way that's somewhere in between. So I'd also like to say that just in terms of context, and the discussion we're having today is really important for Canadians. And we're talking about the largest transition of the Canadian economy and the industrialized economies in the world since the Industrial Revolution. And we need to get this right. The stakes are high. We need to reduce carbon, and we need to save the planet, like not, all before lunch kind of thing, right? So I think it's important for us to keep it in perspective that, the world is going to make these changes and put into place these changes to help us get there, to decarbonize our planet. And it's not going to be a straight line. And we have to work together. We have to work as partners, but we also have to remember that no amount of incentive is going to work if we can't build these projects in time. So that's the real balancing act we need to find. We're not going to get the incentives 100% right, but are we going to get them right enough that we can build these projects? So I would say that we have to, do the best we can, but keep our eye on that regulatory framework. I think it's really critical.
Okay. All right, folks, we have completed 3 rounds. Unless there's a very hot, pressing question that someone would like to ask, I will thank our witnesses very much for, again, all the information you can... No, not going there for sure. Anyway, to our witnesses, thank you again for coming back. I have a feeling...